paper, but I guess I've got one. Okay.
Hello, my name is Furchtgott-Roth, and I'll be your host today here at the Hudson Institute. We're very honored today to have Professor Jonathan Baker of American University speaking with us.
The incompetent Professor Jonathan. Okay.
I could tell an economist joke, but that would reflect on me as well. Just one housekeeping note. I'm in discussions with Professor Philip Hamburger of Columbia University, possibly coming in early June, if not sometime this fall. But today we're greatly honored to have with us Professor Jonathan Baker of American University Law School. He is a well-known academic, and he is the author of a new book on antitrust called the Antitrust Paradigm, published by Harvard University Press. It will be out on Monday. So we have the honor today of being the, I would guess, the last discussion before the formal public availability of the book. So please go to Amazon or your other favorite book distributor. This is the copy of the book, and it's going to make a great read, I'm sure. There are only a few major antitrust books that come out every decade, and this is certainly one of them, and we're very honored to have you here today. Professor Baker will speak for probably half an hour or so. I will then ask a few follow-up questions, and we'll open up to the floor for questions and answers. For those of you viewing online, you can send us questions at Furchtgott-Roth or at Hudson Institute, and we'll include those in the Q&A session. Professor Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, Harold, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Hudson Institute, for inviting me, and all of you for coming. I'm delighted to be here and talk about my book, The Antitrust Paradigm. The audience for the book is antitrust academics and practitioners in part, and it's also should be interesting to people who have broader public policy interests and aren't specialists in antitrust. Once you read it, of course, you will be. So I'm looking forward to that. When I started in the antitrust field, which was 4 decades ago, there were strong disagreements about antitrust policy, and those disagreements were particularly passionate at the Federal Trade Commission in that era. But all of those battles and the discussions were mostly within the antitrust tent. Yet regulatory policy toward large firms was once a central domestic political issue in this country, and it was actually the central domestic political issue in the 1912 election. Antitrust could become more salient again. If you asked me 10 or 20 years ago about policy differences on antitrust between Republican and Democratic administrations, I would say there's really no difference on collusion. The Republicans were somewhat less interventionist on horizontal mergers, and there were greater differences on exclusionary conduct. But there was a broad consensus even on exclusion. When the stakes were highest, and that was in the Microsoft litigation, the en banc, the DC Circuit sitting en banc, all of the judges, including prominent conservatives, unanimously vindicated traditional antitrust principles. We had debates about economic theories and debates about economic evidence, but consensus, I would say, about the underlying policy framework over most of my career. But today I'm no longer as complacent about antitrust, and I'm worried about its future. Let me give you an illustration of the problem by talking about the brewing industry briefly. There are two firms, the firm that owns Budweiser and the firm that owns Miller, and that together they sell about 3/4 of the beer in the United States. They each have many brands, and then there are a large number of craft brewers, but the craft brewers are small and they have costly production distribution technologies. They can't easily expand, so they don't really constrain the large firms. Concentration isn't the problem per se, but it's related to the exercise of market power. And there's a very good recent economic study that uses the modern empirical toolkit, and it shows that coordination in this industry leads to higher prices, and as well as it finds unilateral effects of a recent merger. And as I'm going to explain, this kind of thing is going on in other sectors of the economy too, in part because antitrust has failed. In the brewing industry case, too many mergers were allowed. My worry is not just about the harms from market power per se. I also fear that the acceptance of antitrust as a national economic policy is endangered. Now, and I'll explain that too. So first, let me start with the accumulating evidence that market power is on the rise. It appears to have been growing for decades, but the reasons to think so have largely become evident only in the past 5 years or so. And the first chapter of my book goes through 9 reasons for concern. I'm not going to mention them all here, but they include reasons to think there's insufficient deterrence of anti-competitive conduct. There increased equity ownership of rival firms by large financial investors, higher markups on average in the economy. The markups have been growing for 3 decades, and that's likely related to the growth of information technology, including dominant information technology platforms. There are more concentrated oligopolies in many industries, and there's often independent evidence in the same industries of growing market power. As with my brewing example, we have similar kinds of evidence in empirical economic evidence in hospitals or airlines, say. I'm not talking about aggregate concentration, which is poorly measured. I'm just talking about individual industries, and there are a number where concentration has been growing substantially, and there's reasons to think there's market power that's growing as well. There's less business investment, a greater profit share of gross domestic product, and there are other aspects of reduced economic dynamism in the economy. Slowed rate of startups, slowed rate of expansion when firms become more productive. Growing market power is a leading candidate, or at least one of the leading candidates, to explain these kind of macroeconomic features. Now, in all of these areas and the others that I talk about in the book, there are economic studies that show what the problem that suggests that market power is growing and an increasing problem. And the studies, all have weaknesses, but what's really important is that the weaknesses aren't the same on the studies in the different areas. They're uncorrelated. So the whole here is much greater than the sum of the parts. The evidence taken as a whole demonstrates that market power has been growing. Now, there's a benign explanation for some of the features of the economy that I just talked about as evidence of growing market power. And that benign explanation is there's increasing scale economies and maybe temporary rents to the first movers with information technology. But that can't be the full story. The same fixed costs that create scale economies can deter entry and soften competition. And this benign story can't explain much of the evidence that I work through involving less dynamism, slowed investment, evidence of growing market power in many concentrated industries, insufficient deterrence, or other kinds of evidence I didn't mention. Now, the harms from growing market power are serious. They go beyond the affected buyers or sellers in the markets where market power is being exercised, to economy-wide effects, slowed economic growth and increased inequality. And growing market power means antitrust is not working as it should be. I think of this as today's antitrust paradox. We have substantial and widening market power, notwithstanding extensive antitrust institutions. I'm concerned about our ability to fix the market power problem because I fear that the antitrust political support is threatened. The short summary of my story is that more market power makes big business happy, but as consumers and workers and farmers get a smaller share of the benefits of antitrust and competitive markets, many will give up on antitrust policy and say we need to regulate. And that will usher in a political battle between the regulators and the advocates of a hands-off policy that squeezes out antitrust. So let me explain why I think this in a little more detail. And to do that, I've got to talk about how to understand the 1940s and the 1980s. So in sort of capsule summary of a long history of antitrust and antitrust enforcement, after 1890, when the Sherman Act was enacted, we had inconsistent enforcement and bitter political debate. And I talked a little about that debate before. That debate faded after the 1940s. Antitrust at that time entered what we might call its structural era, where the rules were framed around market concentration and market shares. And those rules, those structural era rules, were relaxed beginning in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, when antitrust entered its Chicago School era. Now, today there's a progressive account of the or neo-Brandeisian, I guess you could sometimes call, account that says of this history that says the 1940s were a triumph for progressive era reformers like Louis Brandeis that was snatched away by Chicago School advocates like Robert Bork. There's also a conservative account of the same history that goes something like this. There was a strong populist antipathy to big business that was reflected in the antitrust rules that were put into place during the 1940s through the 1970s, through the mid-1970s. And that was taken too far. But it was thankfully corrected under the influence of the Chicagoans. I think it's a mistake to view antitrust policy as a choice between Brandeis and Bork. Thinking about it that way, you start to think, well, do we tilt toward consumers, workers, and farmers on the one hand, or towards big business on the other? And that frame wrongly depicts antitrust policy as a zero-sum distributional contest. Chapter 2 of my book describes how I understand the 1940s and the 1970s, or 1970s to 1980s. In the 1940s, the political system in this country reached a consensus for antitrust, a consensus, an informal consensus that I've called a political bargain, although it's not a literal bargain. And that consensus was for using antitrust policy to govern large firms rather than a laissez-faire policy or self-regulation that's by business, which is pretty similar on the one hand, or rather than deconcentration or extensive regulation on the other hand. And picking antitrust rather than laissez-faire or regulation allowed for greater economic growth by relying on competitive markets. Antitrust became a positive-sum policy. And this was acceptable politically because the gains from competitive markets and growth were shared. As a result, the political debate died down, and antitrust enforcement after that time looked technocratic. But then we had economic problems during the 1970s, and after that, the political system took what was in effect a bet offered by the Chicago School. The bet was that if we would modify the antitrust rules to capture more efficiencies, we could do that at little risk of greater market power. And in retrospect, with the evidence we have today, that bet turned out badly. So we need to strengthen antitrust. Otherwise, we'll lose it. And we'll lose the growth and productivity and positive-sum political bargain and enter a zero-sum world of policy over corrections. So as is evident from any of those accounts, really, antitrust law and enforcement operate in a political context. That doesn't mean that politics should influence the resolution of individual cases. There's a strong norm against direct political influence in antitrust. And that's a good thing. It discourages partisan misuse of the antitrust laws and special interest protectionism and the development of a vicious cycle of crony capitalism. Although I say discourages, it doesn't prevent the other, we have to still have to be vigilant in other ways too. Chapter 3 of my book rationalizes the political context of antitrust with the norm against direct political influence. And as I describe there, politics influences decisions, but only indirectly, mediated by ideology. And that perspective I use to explain why insulating enforcement is legitimate in a democracy. Now, in practice, what ideology about antitrust means in the modern era can be summarized as the presumptions that someone brings to the table about the error-cost balance, the balance between, in framing rules, the balance between deterring anti-competitive conduct and avoiding chilling pro-competitive conduct. Today, that balance is systematically skewed because we underdeter. And chapter 4 of my book talks about how the error-cost balance is embedded in presumptions that courts develop and apply when they talk about, when they decide antitrust cases. Progressives say, let's fix the market power problem by bringing in public interest goals. Conservatives today will say, no fix is needed. And what I want to do is strengthen antitrust in a way that's consistent with how antitrust works today by looking to economic theory and empirical evidence to identify ways to alter presumptions to improve the error-cost balance. And I give in that chapter, I give horizontal mergers as an example. And what I want to do there is strengthen the structural presumption. That's the presumption that mergers between rivals that lead to high and increasing concentration harm competition. And I also want to supplement that presumption with two other ones that are, if you're in the antitrust world, they're sort of hinted at in the merger guidelines and part of the antitrust conversation. One would be that there are unilateral anti-competitive effects from the merger of close substitutes, and the other would involve coordinated competitive effects from the acquisition of what's called a maverick. Later chapters talk about other presumptions that ought to be introduced to improve the error-cost balance in different areas. Now, the chapter 5 of my book goes through 9 erroneous arguments about markets and institutions that are used to justify the wrong error-cost balance, the one we have today. And I won't go through all of them, but to give the flavor, contrary to what some people say, markets don't self-correct. Market power is no less durable than erroneous judicial precedents. And antitrust institutions are no more subject to manipulation by complaining competitors than they're subject to manipulation by defendant firms. These kinds of erroneous arguments, the ones that I'm disagreeing with, are damaging when they find sympathetic ears in the courts and at the enforcement agencies. So part 1 of my book, which I've just gone through, is called the Market Power Paroxysm and the Antitrust Paradigm. And the 5 chapters that I just described make a case for strengthening antitrust, looking at law and economics and politics and history. There are a number of ways my book could have gone after that first part. It could have ended there, and I could have called for more enforcement and larger enforcement agency budgets. I could have broadened the lens and talked about domestic policy challenges that go beyond antitrust. I could have identified specific firms or industries where I think there are possible competition problems or troubling practices to investigate. Or I could have looked at ways to improve antitrust institutions. And there are books that do all of those things, and I like to read them. But I didn't want to write one of them, at least not right now, because I wanted to give a prescription as well as a diagnosis. And I wanted to focus on antitrust, not economic policy generally. I think it's hard to discriminate reliably between good conduct and bad conduct, at least often hard to do that, without the kind of investigation that an enforcement agency can do. And a book that tries to say what's good and bad in the practices as a whole, in the economy as a whole today, could quickly become outdated. And I don't see institutional reform as the first place to go to strengthen antitrust. So instead, I wrote a book about how to reform the antitrust rules that are applied by the courts. That's what Carl Kazin and Donald Turner and Robert Bork and Richard Posner did in their famous antitrust books. And like them, and like antitrust generally, my book looks to economics for guidance. I also wrote with an eye toward topical debates by proposing rebuttable presumptions to address problems from the growth of information technology. So part 2 of the book is called Antitrust Rules and the Information Economy. Now, before I kind of get into that, the book highlights ways to strengthen antitrust rules. And that's not because I think efficiencies are unimportant. The political economy argument that I went through is about relying on antitrust to capture more efficiencies than you could capture through hands-off policy or extensive regulation. The problem today is that today's rules are too solicitous to efficiencies, and they're insufficiently attentive to deterrence. So my book focuses on ways to strengthen the rules, as by creating new rebuttable presumptions. Now, it's hard to present part 2. There's no real practical way to go through quickly the examples of algorithmic coordination that I talk about in Chapter 6, exclusionary practices in Chapter 7, economic models of innovation in Chapter 8, or how antitrust rules should address harms to suppliers, workers, and users on multiple sides of platforms, which is the subject of Chapter 9. Instead, I'll just mention a few of the things that the book discusses and give you the flavor of the way that part of the book goes. So Chapter 7 is about exclusionary conduct by dominant platforms. That's a particular problem when strong network effects push toward a winner-take-most market, as with some prominent online platforms. In that kind of a setting, we have to look mainly to small and potential rivals to provide competitive constraints. So exclusionary conduct is particularly harmful. And I'm using the term exclusion broadly. It's not just preventing competition altogether, it also involves ways of disadvantaging rivals. The chapter talks about a number of ways that information technology platforms can harm competition by excluding rivals. Some of them are familiar, like exclusivity through vertical merger or exclusive dealing or predatory pricing. And others are newly enabled by big data. Now, when we talk about big data on the customer side, meaning data about, let's say, end-use consumers, for example, and their their behavior and demographics and the like, that are very specific and detailed and individualized. The antitrust conversation today often involves 3 topics. One is privacy as a non-price dimension of competition, and that's not an unimportant question, although the more important privacy conversation involves consumer protection, not antitrust. A second topic that comes up with respect to big data about consumers is perfect price discrimination, or the possibility of that, and what do we think about that. A third is access to data as an entry barrier, which I talk about in the book in the context of denial of scale economies a little more broadly. My book adds a fourth concern, a targeted price discrimination. And I give some hypothetical examples involving Amazon, although it's not just because I think Amazon is a particular source of problems, just that it's an easy example to give, where Amazon can use potentially and theoretically and hypothetically use data about its customers to give discounts to people who are likely to be really good customers for, let's say, Walmart's competing platform, or Amazon, and then exclude Walmart that way, without having to give those discounts to its own customers. Or it can do it with respect to individual products. So if it has a private label diapers brand and can identify consumers who are likely to buy Pampers or Huggies, it could give targeted discounts to those to those consumers, and potentially advantage its private label diapers product. And it's got other exclusionary tools potentially do the same thing, involving its search results, let's say, or copying new product features or something like that. But targeted price discrimination is also a possibility. And my book talks about how this could work with big data generally. Another way an information technology platform can exclude, and this is, again, one of a number that I'm talking about in the chapter, is by increasing customer switching costs. And that's a particular threat with a dominant platform because, as I said before, competition may turn primarily on the ability of smaller rivals or potential entrants to obtain scale economies, by taking business away from the platform leader. So practices that increase customer switching costs interdict that mechanism and makes the possibility of competition more costly or difficult, especially when end users don't multi-home, or feedback effects across platform sides enhance the exclusionary effect of greater captivity on one side. So this is a way of understanding the competitive problem in some well-known past antitrust cases that involving exclusionary conduct by dominant platforms that you might be familiar with, such as what the Lorraine Journal newspaper did by refusing to accept advertisements by firms that advertised on a competing radio station, or what the FTD flower delivery network did by preventing its members from using rival platforms. Chapter 8's about threats to innovation from lessened competition, and it talks about mergers and exclusionary conduct by dominant firms. On mergers, it talks about two general possibilities. One is that when the merger partners if the merger partners would take business away from each other in the event their R&D is successful, the merged firm would have an incentive to cut back on R&D. And that's a concern that's reflected in the horizontal merger guidelines today. The other possibility that it talks about in the chapter is that a merger between actual or potential innovation rivals could harm innovation by discouraging R&D investment by non-merging firms. So suppose we have an industry where small firms have an incentive to let their products be used on rival platforms. An example, you could think about, say, a small gaming system that makes games, and you could use it on other platforms too. In that kind of an industry, a merger that creates a dominant firm might lead the merging firms to change their strategy and upgrade products in ways that increase customer switching costs. So I'm postulating that we've got a merger that, let's say it's two 30% share firms that become 60%. The increased customer captivity might make it harder for smaller rivals to sell their own product upgrades, and that could lead those rivals to reduce their own R&D efforts and lessen R&D competition in the industry overall. Another possibility about mergers discouraging rival investments by non-merging firms is that a dominant firm in an innovative sector might acquire a firm that doesn't compete strongly with it now. So suppose the firm it's buying has capabilities like R&D expertise and a distribution network that make it a threat to compete in future products, but it may not actually be developing those products now. Suppose further that the dominant firm would be expected to respond to R&D threats with greater R&D investment of its own. So then the merger of the dominant firm acquiring the firm with the capabilities would lessen R&D competition, at least in an expected sense. It would give the dominant firm an incentive to channel the acquired firm's R&D capabilities into developing complementary products not substitutes for the dominant firm's products. And that's the kind of story that could have been investigated when Facebook acquired Instagram, to give you an example. All right, so we got a little bit into some of the details and give you the flavor of the chapters about the new economy, information economy issues. And so far, I've talked about substantial and widening market power in the United States, and that the political consensus for antitrust has been threatened, and how the information economy raises novel challenges for competition policy. But there's an elephant in the room, and that's the Supreme Court, which has not yet signaled any interest in changing course. Chapter 10, and that's the final chapter of the book, is about how to make progress. And it looks to Microsoft, when I say Microsoft, the 2001 en banc decision of the DC Circuit that I referred to before, the unanimous decision. And it looks to that decision as a model. That's the most important antitrust decision of the past 3 decades, and it supported enforcement. It reaffirmed antitrust's concern with exclusionary conduct and elaborated on the legal framework for analyzing it through a sort of a structured rule of reason approach. It made clear, as we always knew, but reaffirmed as well, that antitrust reaches nascent harms and threats to potential competition, even in innovative industries. It ridiculed Microsoft's claim that it has an absolute and unfettered right to use its intellectual property as it wishes, even if competition's harmed. And the decision was supported by prominent antitrust conservatives. It was unanimous, and they didn't sign their names to the opinion, but they were all on it, including Judge Douglas Ginsburg. Judge Ginsburg's an antitrust expert. He was the head of the antitrust division during the Reagan administration. And he's a prolific writer on antitrust issues and always has been, often from, or in general from what you might call a Chicago school-oriented perspective. And Microsoft did all of this, the DC Circuit decision, in a highly politicized environment. Microsoft, the company, had challenged the legitimacy of antitrust. It had conducted a public relations campaign that argued that antitrust enforcement was threatening its freedom to innovate. It depicted the Justice Department as the pawn of its inefficient rivals, and it lobbied to cut the Justice Department's antitrust enforcement budget. The DC Circuit, the unanimous en banc decision, rejected Microsoft's indictment and reaffirmed antitrust's legitimacy, essentially by coming out the way it did. And the case shows that when strong facts support a sensible economic analysis, judges of all perspectives can reach pro-enforcement decisions, even when the case is prominent and the stakes are high. Antitrust enforcement is not the enemy of high tech. Innovation has not been, was not chilled. And since that case, the information technology industry has flourished. So taking a cue from the Microsoft decision, my program for strengthening antitrust begins with increasing awareness of market power and its costs. What I'd like to hear is antitrust enforcers and commentators who are relatively conservative say, well, we need to recalibrate the antitrust rules to increase deterrence. Even if I don't agree with all the details of how you all want to do it, there's something to worry about here, and we ought to do something. That would be something like what a leading liberal, Robert Petoskey, said, who later became chair of the Federal Trade Commission. What Bob Petoskey said in response to the Chicago critiques, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Second, I think we need to nurture what appears to be an incipient or emerging political mobilization against market power. Because if we have popular attention to the market power problem, that will encourage the political branches to support more enforcement, and that will indirectly influence the courts. Third, I think the antitrust agencies should push the courts to strengthen antitrust They can do that in their litigation, their choice of cases that they bring, and in the kind of advocacy they do, speeches and other forms of advocacy to the public and to Congress and state legislatures. Fourth, it's government plaintiffs and private plaintiffs, and the government plaintiffs could include the states as well, can exploit the space that's created by lower courts that are sympathetic to a problem. Not every case ends up in the Supreme Court. And then finally, plaintiffs should rely heavily on arguments rooted in modern economics. When those arguments are supported by strong evidence, that's the best route to persuade a Supreme Court that sees the antitrust laws as advancing economic goals and persuade it to uphold good cases under the current rules and support better rules. So that's why one of the chapters in my book explains the error in 9 arguments about markets and institutions that are used to justify striking the wrong error-cost balance, and why others defend pro-enforcement presumptions on economic grounds. By pushing back on all these fronts, and by looking to the Antitrust Paradigm, which is the title of my book, and renewing it with contemporary challenges in mind, we can hope to restore a competitive economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. It's great to have you here at Hudson. It's great to have you here speaking about the antitrust paradigm. As you know, at the last few years of his career, Bob Bork was here at Hudson, and he was a senior fellow, and he was the author of the Antitrust Paradox. So I love the sort of the play on words here. Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with the title of your book and what it means to you?
The title wasn't actually my idea. Do you know, it was actually, I had a conversation decades ago with Bobby Willig,
Sure.
Who was a prominent economist at Princeton and was my boss at one time when I was his special assistant when he was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics at the Antitrust Division. And I don't recall quite when we had this conversation. It wasn't necessarily then. But I was talking about writing an antitrust book, and Bobby has this way with words, and so Bobby came up with the title. But I've always had it in mind, and it fit here, both because the book is really, in some sense, at least in part, taking issue with the perspective that Judge Bork took. And partly because it's supporting antitrust as the right way to organize the economy to address the problems of large firms, and treating it as a paradigm that was accepted in this country, at least beginning in the 1940s. And so it fit my argument as well.
You mentioned Supreme Court cases, and a Supreme Court case, one of the few in the past 20 years, was Trinco. And Trinco really, to me, addressed the tension between antitrust and regulation, and essentially said, if you're a regulated firm and you're complying with regulations, you can't be subject to antitrust prosecution. And you point out this tension, if you will, between antitrust enforcement on the one hand and regulation on the other. And I was wondering if you could just expand a bit on that, because I do see this as something that conservative economists like me over decades have sort of said, well, we don't need as much regulation, we can rely on antitrust enforcement instead. But that's assuming that there actually is antitrust enforcement there to replace the regulation.
So your question raises a whole lot of issues, and a number come to mind, and one of which is I'm reminded of the way the debates were framed about antitrust in the 1930s and 40s. If you read speeches by, let's say, by Justice Robert Jackson, who before he was on the Supreme Court, he's a famous justice. He was, I think, at the prosecutor in Nuremberg for the United States, and he was the head of the antitrust division appointed by Franklin Roosevelt just before Thurman Arnold became the head. And in a lot of ways, what Arnold did, and Arnold's the more to help shape what I describe as the political bargain, has roots in what Justice Jackson did before. And the reason I bring him up is that the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust now, Macon Delrame, celebrated Justice Jackson's antitrust work at one point in a speech. So that, this is not this is a mainstream antitrust view of conservatives and liberals. And if you read his speeches from the 40s and the 30s, he's talking about how if we don't have antitrust, we'll have socialism, more or less. And what he means by that is a much more regulated economy, and that's the way in which the politics was before the 1940s. We had an era of industry self-regulation. That was a prominent view in the 1920s, and Republican presidents then, Hoover, for example, and Coolidge, and who was the one in between?
Harding,
yeah,
Hoover.
Okay. There was, and yet we also had prominent voices looking for much more regulatory alternatives, like the way Justice Brandeis was. So partly I have in mind those old debates, which I worry would return if we allow the market power to grow, and in effect repeal the antitrust laws by stealth, which is what I fear may be happening unless we don't strengthen antitrust. Partly your question reminds me of there's a narrow technical issue about whether when their industries are regulated, should we also allow antitrust? And there's a reading of the Trinco decision itself, which is that it only applies to narrowly regulated firms. And the Supreme Court in the past couple decades has been interested in the boundary between regulation and antitrust, and has actually expanded exemptions from antitrust for regulated industries. And that was in securities law and other areas from what they've been for decades before. And I don't think you're asking about that, but there is a problem there about how the courts are actually allowing regulation to expand relative to antitrust. And then finally, what Trinco reminds me of is something that you didn't actually raise, but it's actually important feature of the rhetoric of that decision. That was a unanimous decision written by Justice Scalia. And one way of reading the rhetoric of that decision, not the narrow holding, which is about regulated industries and the application of antitrust, is that it encourages, that it almost celebrates monopolies as a spur to innovation. And I'm actually worried about that, because firms definitely need to be able to appropriate benefits of the rewards from innovation in order, or expect to be able to appropriate the rewards from some of the rewards of innovation to the economy in order to give themselves an incentive to innovate. But the way I read the economics literature, the more important force for innovation is competition. That firms want to innovate to escape competition, and if we don't have an antitrust system that encourages competition as a way of promoting innovation, we'll end up with less innovation, I believe, and that includes a regulated approach too.
That's kind of the debate between folks who like competition, probably like you and I do, and the kind of the Schumpeterian approach of you need big firms to get innovation. Final question before I turn it over to the audience. You mentioned the 1970s as the precursor to the Chicago School, and I'd never really thought about it before, but if you think about the problems of the 1970s, whether it's political unrest or the oil embargo, really bad monetary policy, I'm hard-pressed to think of something in the 1970s that was actually an antitrust problem, and yet your interpretation is Chicago School comes about because of the economic doldrums of the 1970s, which probably were not caused by bad antitrust policy, or am I missing something there?
Yes and no. We had serious economic problems in the 1970s that Harold and I recommend that you young folks remember, and you young folks don't. There was inflation, unemployment, a couple of recessions, the oil price shocks contributed to inflation, and slowed productivity. And a lot of policymaking was worrying about how to get the economy going again, and that was the environment in which Chicago School arguments, which had been around for decades, a couple decades, started to become prominent. It was because they were seen as a vehicle for as an answer to, or as part of the way to get the economy going again. Let's get rid of excessively regulatory antitrust would have been the story. And unleash firms to capture more efficiencies, and that would be one part of the way in which we could get the economy going again. And this was also, all of the U.S. politics became less interested in regulation. That was the same era where at the end of the 70s was when the first deregulation occurred. The Kennedy-Breyer hearings and airline deregulation. Deregulation was originally bipartisan, and then then it became more associated with Republicans in the 1980s. So I see the economic problems of the 1970s as creating the environment in which the political system could seize on Chicago School arguments as one of the things, one of the approaches towards getting the economy going again. And that was certainly what after the election of President Reagan, what the enforcement agencies and the courts started to do in an aggressive way.
I could keep going asking questions, but let me open it up to the audience. We will have folks passing microphones around, and then please identify yourself. The gentleman here.
Thank you. Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic International Studies. It seems to me, as I recall, the Chicago School was pretty strong on having antitrust, because that's how you were going to, because the key to the Chicago School was efficient and competitive markets. And so you don't want to have the opposite of that. And that was why antitrust got in there. In fact, I think Friedman famously once said the only thing government should be doing is antitrust laws. I think he was exaggerating his position, of course, defense. But I guess I wonder about markets themselves. So if you read any of the stories about beer, to use your example, Miller and Bud are losing market share, and they're losing their share price, and they're losing it to two areas. One is the craft beers that you talked about, and the other is to beverages that are not beer. And I wonder if both internal market change and foreign competition, which did a number on the automobile industry, for example, are those not areas that also need to be factored into how much regulation government should apply to markets and to actors in order to get efficient markets?
So those are two good questions. Although you didn't ask the first as a question, I'm going to treat it as one. So let me first tell you about, you sort of say the Chicago School figures wanted strong antitrust. What Robert Bork calls for in his book is essentially that the antitrust agencies should enforce laws against naked horizontal price fixing and market division. So when firms just get together to agree to raise price or to divide up markets, they should challenge mergers that lead to monopolies or near monopolies, but essentially not at other mergers. And that the antitrust enforcement should largely get out of the business of challenging various kinds of exclusionary conduct, including vertical kinds of practices that aren't promoting collusion. His only real exception was, his major exception was conduct involving misuse of governmental processes, which he thought when firms can get the government involved in keeping out their rivals, that could be an antitrust problem. And he had a very, he agreed that the Lorraine Journal decision was fine, but he was largely skeptical of other kinds of monopolization decisions, which are basically about exclusionary conduct and vertical and challenging monopolization or challenging vertical practices. So it was a very much more restricted view of what the antitrust laws ought to do than what had been going on before, or even what we do today. We haven't quite gotten to the full Borkian antitrust in the way the Chicago School views influenced the Supreme Court since. Yes, he would probably describe what he was advocating as strong antitrust, but his vision of antitrust was really not the same as what it traditionally had been or what it ought to be. Right, so then that's the first half of what you raised. The second half about brewing, you're right in principle that we have to that if you're looking at whether there's a competitive problem in industry, you need to worry about whether small firms can expand, whether foreign firms, if it's a U.S. industry, whether competition from foreign firms will discipline domestic firms, and whether and it's also possible that the market as a whole can be shrinking, although whether that isn't necessarily a reason not to do antitrust enforcement. That was what you were talking about substitution of other beverages for beer. To the extent that occurs, that could actually make competitive problems worse, because maybe you lose the customers who are have the lowest willingness to pay for beer, and the ones that are left are real beer loyalists, and you can really exploit them by exercising market power. I'm not saying that's necessarily what's going on, but my point is simply that this as a factor is not necessarily a reason to avoid worrying about competitive problems. And I think it's that the evidence shows that in the brewing industry today, the forces that you described just don't add up to leading what's essentially a two-firm industry to be competitive in practice.
Next question. That's the gentleman here.
My name is Sam Miranda. I don't have an affiliation. I'm a retired nuclear engineer. And I recall from business school and my courses in antitrust and the Sherman Antitrust Act, and to oversimplify it perhaps, is collusion between companies in order to serve each other or themselves at the expense of consumers. But I saw in my career, 45-year career in nuclear engineering, both private and public sectors, collusion between regulators and regulated. And I can give you several examples. Probably the most salient one today involves Exelon, which operates the largest number of nuclear plants in the country. And they have entered into a contract to buy nuclear fuel from TVEL, which is a
Can I
subsidiary.
just pause? I think it's well understood that we have the possibility of regulatory capture, and I don't think we need the full example. So,
Oh, I'm getting to sanctions and why the company that Exelon is dealing with, a Russian company, which also has contracts in Iran, is not on the sanctions list, and why?
so I don't know that that's all right. So let me just answer in this way. There's a long literature on the possibility of regulatory capture, and there's certainly concern about that, where the regulators end up acting to help the regulated industry rather than in the public interest, which is, what the antitrust laws are supposed to do too. And it's also true that the government can create barriers to competition, and they might do that at the behest of the incumbent firms, prevent new entrants from coming in various ways by writing rules, and that can be a competitive problem. And there are reasons to think that might be growing in some places, and there's some examples in pharmaceuticals that are very recent too. I'm agreeing with the premise that there's a potential for regulation to both harm competition and the economy, particularly when the regulators decide they're really interested in the health of the regulated industry rather than the economy as a whole. And that's one of the reasons to worry about growing market power in the economy. But I don't think those particular problems are antitrust problems of the sort that I am worrying about in my book and in my presentation today.
Question over here.
Thank you. My name is Todd Wiggins. I was just on an event yesterday I think you would have found to be very interesting. It was the Electronics Association, CES, it referred to Consumer Electronics Association, had a big expo on the Hill. And one of the things that I found that was fascinating was the Amazon model for warehouse storage and disbursement of their products. And it is extraordinary what they've been able to do with robotics and AI, et cetera, et cetera. So do you see them, and I'm just drawing the analogy to Ma Bell and AT&T in the 80s, et cetera, do you see them at some point being addressed by these antitrust laws in a significant way?
Let me answer this way. There are a number of large firms that we all know that have been very successful online, Amazon's one of them, and Facebook and Google, and or others, and there are more besides. And in general, these firms have vastly increased our well-being, and do great things for consumers and for the economy as a whole. And you're describing a way in which Amazon's investing in ways to bring products to us quicker, with less error, or whatever, or less expensively, and the like. And that's great. And I have nothing against large firms. And I would have probably said the same thing about, let's say, Standard Oil, when because it developed ways of making refining, cheaper and too. But large firms can do great things and bring efficiencies to the economy and valuable products and services to consumers, and they can still also harm competition. And so the concern isn't, the issue isn't whether we should have large firms or not in the online world or otherwise. It's whether we can encourage them to do the things we want them to do, lower costs and develop new products and improve all of our lives through competition, and by having them compete or be disciplined by the threat of competition, the potential competition, and actual competition, and the potential for small firms to grow and the like. Whether we can do that in our economy in order to get even more benefits from what these firms can accomplish. Unless if we think, some people, I guess, raise the prospect that large online platforms are effectively natural monopolies where you can't have competition. If we really thought that, then I think we'd want to regulate the way we, as we do with, I don't know, the water system or something like.
Yeah, right.
But that's well beyond where I think we are now in thinking about the dominant online platforms too.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Baker.
Thank you.